Welcome back to the Replatform podcast. Thanks as always for tuning in. If you're new to the podcast, thanks for joining us. And please do subscribe if you like this episode. We want to get as many people listening as possible. And we'd love likes and ratings on Apple and Spotify and also on YouTube, please. It helps to extend our reach. Well, that's our shameless plug over. Let's get cracking with the episode. So it's myself, James Gerd, and I'm joined by my co-host, Paul Rogers. How are you doing today, mate?
Yeah, good. Thanks. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, Tar. I'm looking forward to our little Talking Heads episode. There's no guest today. It's just myself and Paul waxing lyrical about e-commerce and replatforming. So there's a question that we often get asked in projects, which is, what roles do I need in my project team? What are the key roles for replatforming? I'm sure this comes up quite often for you, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all the time. I think it's usually one of the first questions I would get asked when someone starts thinking about replatforming.
Yeah, exactly. Same for me. And typically, especially in the SME space where people might not have that high level project experience, or they might not have gone through it as an organization before. And it's such an important question because you've got to get the right blend of skills, and you've also got to get the right cultural mix of people who could work effectively, because these projects are typically long. Complexity varies depending on size of business. And therefore, people have got to work together effectively. So understanding roles and responsibilities and knowing which person to fit into them is really important. So, Paul, a good starting point before we share our views on what are the key roles and what should they be doing is, what is the impact of not having the right people and the right roles in place? Like, what are the risks to a business?
So I think the obvious one is, I guess, projects not being delivered to the right standard or on time or on budget, dependent on the kind of people that maybe aren't best suited to the role they're filling. I think I know one of the bits that you're going to talk about is kind of getting all this stuff managed up front. For me, that's the key. And I think the other thing is one of the biggest reasons I get asked this question is usually because someone's trying to balance the kind of day-to-day trading of a website, or kind of, trading through peaks, or, there's other projects going on in the business. And essentially, how can they build a team, particularly with the bigger companies, how can they build a team that can successfully deliver a replatforming project? So the impact actually might be on other areas rather than the replatforming project as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice summary. So, with that in mind, there are risks. All these projects have risks, but getting things defined and structured up front can help mitigate that risk. So let's talk about key roles and what they do. So we're going to kind of dovetail here on some key areas. I'm going to start on the business and finance side. So number one, project sponsor. Project sponsor is somebody who has board level, senior management executive power, which means that they are able to get decisions made. And they are also able to help if there is any escalation required, where an issue in a project needs to be taken up to that senior business level for validation, review, sign off, etc. A sponsor is essential because they give the rest of the project team that representation at decision-making level to ensure that projects don't grind to a standstill through inefficient decision-making or lack of the ability to make a decision when one's needed. A good example of this is in budgets. So I've been in projects before where something has been learned during the in-depth technical discovery workshops, where actually some additional budget has been required because of business process changes that have created additional development needs. And the business would either have to accept a compromised solution, or it needs to find that extra budget. That can then lead to an inertia in the project where the project can't proceed because the budget's not approved. And having somebody who's got the impetus at board level to take that up, fight for that cause and get that resolved very, very quickly, whatever the decision is, so the project can then progress, it's important. So that's the sponsor's role. Then got client lead, who is the business owner. They are the day-to-day person who's got day-to-day responsibility for running the project internally. And that means coordinating internal resource, where there are actions that the client team has to take, making sure those actions are being taken and that the right priorities are being focused on. Typically, this is the senior e-commerce person, because they will need to have an understanding of the e-commerce demands for the project so that they can instill e-commerce good practice and make sure decision-making is done with the best interest, not just of the e-commerce business, but the wider business as well, and e-commerce's touch points with it. So you would expect this person to be one of your classic T-shaped, very specific expertise in e-commerce, but generalist commercial and business skills across the business. The next one is subject matter experts. And this includes all the key functional areas of business, including IT, finance, logistics, merchandising, trading, and there are an exponential number of these depending on the size of business. When I worked with House of Fraser, I think we had about 20 odd subject matter experts, simply because of the size of the teams. There was an SEO subject matter expert, there was a paid media expert, etc. So these people, their responsibility is not to run the project. They're not basically seconded out of their day-to-day job, but they have to have part of their time dedicated to this project to support as and when their input is needed, to define requirements, to validate captured requirements and make sure that anything that's passed through to development streams is accurate and represents their business area, that they're involved in UAT. So when things are being deployed before going live, that they are validating that the development is being done to the right standards based on their requirements, and they're helping the project team problem solve. So if there is an issue with one requirement that's related to their part of the business, they work with the project team to find the right compromise and solutions so the project can then proceed. And they are absolutely essential, because if you don't get their buy-in from the start, you can find that projects get derailed later on because you come to a grinding halt when the development team needs input, but this person who's responsible for, say, SEO has not been brought into the project, and therefore they can't hit the ground running. And then the last one for me in this area, which is dependent, and we've had this conversation before, Paul, haven't we, about size of business and the impact on how many people you need, is procurement. In some businesses, there are specific procurement processes that have to be adhered to in order to get technology vendors signed off, to get SI, systems integrator partners, new third-party tools that you need in the project. And there is a procurement officer who ensures that the project follows the procurement process for sign-off. And that person can be a separate stakeholder. In smaller businesses, the person who makes all of these decisions, the subject matter expert, the person who's responsible for getting the budget approved and signing off on the investment in tools and putting credit cards online to pay for a third-party tool, is often the same person. It's the e-commerce lead. So you've got to understand the roles and responsibilities, and then you can decide who in the business is appropriate for them, or whether you need external. So that's my bit. Any obvious ones you think I've missed out, Paul?
No, I don't think so. I think you've covered everything. Like you said, I think there's kind of variables dependent on the size of the business and project and everything else. But no, I think that's covered everything from my perspective. Cool.
So let's, why don't you go lead on to the creative side then? Because the creative is very much related to this, because essentially they are a subject matter expert, but it's offers in a very distinct phase of the project.
Yeah, perfect. So I think to start off, I guess there's loads of variables in this, and it depends on the scope of the project. So my first part of this one I'm going to base on a full redesign as part of a replatforming project, which isn't always the case, not always the best thing for the business. But essentially, I'm defining the roles for where there is a full redesign. And I was discussing this with someone the other day, and I think from my perspective, I think the ideal team structure, and this is basing it on the types of clients I work with, which is typically a premium fashion brand maybe, would be you have your kind of internal creative lead, who might be the creative director, or I don't know, head of brand or whoever else, and they're essentially responsible for brand, maybe a level of art direction, content, everything kind of around branding content. So you have their kind of input. You then maybe have an external kind of creative director. So a lot of the best projects I've worked on, they've kind of brought in an external expert who is literally just day in, day out, working on kind of designing and coming up with different concepts for kind of best in class sites within a specific vertical. So they've got lots of experience at kind of delivering, best of breed sites. You then might have some, and that person would kind of collaborate with the internal person when it comes to building out a set of digital brand guidelines, maybe some of the art direction stuff. Maybe they would kind of collaborate on some of the content and push that a bit harder, etc. You would then have ideally, so if you've got an external development agency as well, you'd probably have someone from that team, be it their creative lead or potentially a very senior front-end developer, inputting into that conversation as well. So that you've essentially got different influences. You've got the brand person, you've got the kind of more creative person that is thinking beyond what's happening internally and beyond the platform that you're building on and the templates and everything else. And then they're kind of collaborating to build something that's unique, in line with how the platform works, and also is heavily based on the existing brand guidelines, but maybe there's like some scope to kind of evolve those a little bit as well. Obviously, and then you may also have an internal person that's responsible for like providing content and kind of owns content internally. And I would say that's like my preferred structure these days for going through like a proper redesign, because I think there's a lot of development agencies that do really good design work, but I don't think there's too many that are like, top of the industry for both design and development. So I really like the idea of separating it out, but equally, I mean, it can still work really well. I mean, we've done a number of projects with development agencies who have done a really good job, but I think if you want best, like proper, like, industry leading front end experience, I'm personally a big fan of using an external design agency or creative director, etc. And then I think if it's not a redesign, so if you're replatforming and you've got a really tight timeline, and you're essentially looking at taking the existing website and moving it onto a new platform, maybe with some level of like functional evolution or some optimizations around like mobile checkout, etc. I think in that scenario you probably don't need any external design resource, and you can either do it with the development agency or with an in-house team. And obviously that first bit is quite it's based on quite a specific scenario, because a lot of people do have actual in-house teams and they're pretty good, and maybe there's a bit of bias internally as well where they kind of have to use that team. What do you think, James? Have you got anything to add to that bit?
Yeah, I think it's a good distinction in terms of the roles you need depend on what type of project. So if you're just lifting and shifting to a new technology and you're not doing any design, then typically somebody who's got control of the in-house brand styles and creative execution is sufficient, alongside a good development agency with good front-end developers, because they will just inherit if the digital design guidelines are to the good standards, 100%. But yeah, I like the thing you said about it's almost like positively challenging the internal status quo, because a lot of times from an internal branding and design point of view, there's a very prescriptive way of doing it. This is how we do it, but it doesn't necessarily have that wider external perspective of, okay, but we've done this for 15, 20 different websites and we've learnt different ways, and maybe we could improve the overall user experience and user journey with a bit of additional thinking, still maintaining it within the overall brand guidelines and style and creative delivery. So yeah, I 100% agree. External perspectives to challenge internal brand teams are very important. It is, the politics bit is hard on that bit, isn't it? Because some businesses are open to it and others aren't. But you need that role. You fundamentally have to have somebody who's got the ability to look at the overall user experience and ensure that it's delivered correctly and that user interaction design is done well. And brand people can be wonderful at executing on brand vision strategy, but they might not necessarily understand the nuances of interaction design on on mobile devices, for example.
Yeah. And I think at that point you just said there around the politics. So I've done 2 projects recently with very brand-led businesses, and it worked really well with like an external person collaborating with the internal team and then collaborating with the development agency. But it only worked well because those kind of internal creative directors played a bit. Firstly, there was a lot of work that went into getting them bought into using someone external, because ultimately they're broader, their remit is broader. They're not specialists on the kind of, web design, UI, UX design side, and kind of the new age of like modern, engaging kind of, themes and everything else. And then secondly, they played a big part in selecting the partner, which I think is really important.
Yeah, excellent. So let's move on. Next kind of grouping is project management office. So the project management office, it sounds like a very formal term for bigger projects, but it's relevant to everything. It's simply the how the core project is organised so that it's functionally fit for purpose. There are some core roles. And again, we're talking about roles and responsibilities. It doesn't mean that every project has to have different people for each role. It could be one person doing this, and it often is in smaller businesses. So number one is project manager. There's a technical and a business PM. The technical PM is the person responsible for ensuring that all of the requirements are captured in the right detail that can be pushed through into development sprints, and that the development teams are being managed effectively, that sprint planning is done, the output of sprints is reviewed, that you have an assessment of any issues that come out of sprints that need to be taken into the next one, that timelines are being managed accurately. So if there's any slippage, that it's dealt with when it happens rather than left until it becomes like an unmanageable issue in a project. It's so important. And that technical person typically comes from the development agency. They would lead the project during implementation, but they would need a counterpart within the client team, which is why I split it out to technical and business PM. Now, the business PM in, I guess, medium to large organizations is normally a specific role. In medium businesses, often you find it's a contractor brought in who's an e-commerce project manager by trade, because often medium-sized businesses don't necessarily have that skill as a full-time person. And they would work alongside the technical PM and the developers to ensure that the project is controlled and all the internal stakeholders of the client are managed and inputting correctly. On smaller businesses, that business PM is like the business lead. It's the e-commerce manager, because you don't have the luxury or the budget to bring in somebody else. But that role's needed. A development agency's project manager needs a day-to-day counterpart who they can interface with and who can take issues back to the business or questions back for resolution. That's critical to keep the project going. Business analyst is the next one. So these projects often unearth inefficiencies in business process. So I've seen this before in the way that product is onboarded into websites, where product data sits, how it gets input into systems, what happens when there's an outage of stock. There are a lot of manual processes that still exist that take unnecessary time out of businesses. Part of the replatforming, client teams often want to unpick that efficiency and improve process. But if the process isn't documented in the first place, very, very hard for a development partner to review it, assess it, and show what the to-be improved process will be. So BA is very good at coming in and not only just capturing business requirements, but properly documenting business process in the right way that it can be used within the project. Now, that is often provided by the agency. It could be a contract resource. I worked on one project, a fashion project as well, and there was no specific BA skill provision, and we basically brought somebody in for 2 months to do an intensive bit of process mapping and documentation so that we had it all to take into the project for the technical PM. So again, it doesn't have to be a full-time thing. It can be, we have 3 or 4 things we've got to do. Let's bring in a contractor to do it. And then the other ones in project management, you need an account manager from your agency you're working with. They have to have the responsibility for making sure that your relationship is being managed effectively, your expectations are being set, that any issues that crop up, if there's any disagreements or there's a change to scope and that involves change in budget or change in cost, that this is managed commercially effectively. So the account manager would work alongside a project manager to deal with the commercial elements and the relationship side to allow the PM to focus purely on project delivery. However, depending on project size, the account manager and PM are the same person. So again, it's the role you have to understand. There's commercial management and there's project delivery management. And then the last one I guess I'll put in here is a change manager. All of these projects involve large amounts of change, or unless you're just doing a very simple lift and shift and that is it, and therefore the change is easy to manage. But still then you've got data transfer, customer data, order history migration. You might be doing a brand refresh, as Paul, you alluded to earlier. You might be changing third-party systems. There's internal process changes. You've got to train people up on new systems. So there's all this change going on, and that needs documenting to map out what the change requirements are, what the impact is, who's affected, and having those as individual work tasks that can be tracked and prioritized with timelines to make sure that when you get to launch, everybody is ready to start working on that new platform. And I've worked on projects like House of Fraser, huge global IT project, where there was a specific change manager and they were full-time on the project from start to finish. And I've worked in other businesses where I've sat and worked with the e-commerce lead to explain what change management streams need to be thought about so that they can go off and manage it directly rather than having a specialist in there. So again, the role has to be understood. Who does it is entirely dependent on the size and complexity of project. So that's my kind of garbled summary of the project management office. Anything you think's missing? Anything you'd add to that?
No, I don't think so. I think the BA one's an interesting one, because I think a lot of the companies that I would work with, and I know the smaller ones you would work with as well, wouldn't typically have that that role internally. But I think if you're, when you're looking at agencies and everything else, I do think that is a good role to have in a project team across both sides. Just because it kind of like enforces a certain level of detail around kind of scoping. Usually having like a specialist BA would encourage broader thinking and more kind of business context as well. I think that's kind of an undervalued role overall.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I did a project with the RHS, Royal Horticultural Society, and they're a big brand, right? But the project in relation to other ones I've done, given the budgets and the size of their e-commerce, was a small project with a small project team. And they had a BA internally seconded. She was seconded out of the IT team. And the value she added to the project was immense, because the business wasn't experiencing capturing requirements and documenting. They didn't want to spend money on an external consultant and me documenting business requirements, because that's obviously not as cost effective. And she was fantastic at really getting to the heart of what the requirement was, and validating it, and going internally to the stakeholders, validating what it really meant and why, and then working to get the prioritization right. That meant the documentation quality that went into the project for the agency partner to do the evaluation, estimation, and then to push into development queues was way, way better. And it also meant that the quality of the development work that came back out for UAT was higher than it would have been if the requirements had been muddled or not properly spec'd.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a good segue for you to go on to the more technical side of the project.
Yeah, so I think this one's another one similar to creative, where there's loads of variables dependent on kind of the size of the business and everything else. And I also think you'll probably have maybe a different kind of, or you'll have different experience on this with some of the bigger projects you've worked on, because I typically work on smaller projects. But the first one is solution architect. So in my experience, a solution architect would usually be a platform expert. So if it's a Magento migration, there might be either an internal or independent solution architect that's been brought into the project team that is essentially kind of defining certain kind of technical solutions. They're overlooking kind of the quality of what's being delivered. They're kind of governing things all the way through from a technical perspective, and then they're potentially taking on certain deliverables as well. So things like certain aspects of data migration or some other kind of technical considerations with third parties. But they're essentially there as an architect. And then dependent on the structure of the internal team, you might have a lead engineer who would be making a lot of those kind of technical decisions. And if the development's being delivered internally, they would be kind of overlooking the delivery of what's being built. And kind of managing their team. You then have back-end and front-end developers. And again, I feel like, particularly with the brands that I work with, it's become really common for them to want to take development in-house. They outsource the build, and then they're kind of building out teams. So you might have like a bit of a hybrid as well. But yes, you may have back-end and front-end developers internally. Back-end developers obviously working more on kind of, the back-end side of things and kind of, custom kind of modules and any kind of potential some level of integration work, etc. And then front end kind of building out the theme and working with all the different kind of third parties that impact the front end. I've put IT team in here just because the majority of our clients would have someone within the IT team who would own the integrations. And maybe they've kind of, they've got their own kind of integration layer or middleware or whatever, and they would kind of own the delivery of that side of things. Scrum Master, so essentially on kind of, bit of a hybrid between that PMO piece and technical piece, but more responsible for kind of delivery. Test lead. So this is quite an interesting one. I think we could almost do a discussion, an episode on this kind of testing and UAT ourselves anyway, but you've got kind of different levels of testing throughout the project, and then the UAT phase. So the test lead might be responsible for kind of writing test scripts and then actually kind of undertaking some level of testing and managing different resources as well as part of that. So you've got the more technical side, so integration testing, some of the back end testing, etc. And then the kind of front end UAT as well. And actually, so you've listed out QA and UAT separately here, so that kind of falls into that one anyway, but I know you can split those out anyway. And What are your thoughts on that? Anything that you would change? Because I guess, like I said, I think you've probably got some different experiences to me as well.
I don't know. It's interesting because you say I worked on bigger projects, but I mean, the brands you've worked with, I think it's different where the scale is. Like you've worked on massive brands like Japan Guys. I mean, they're doing big numbers online. A lot of the businesses I've worked with tend to be more traditional organisations rather than newer D2C brands that are fast growth and massive backing. So I think that the scale is similar. It's just the nature of the business and the kind of resources they have in house and legacy. So the business I tend to work with wouldn't have as many. They wouldn't be as strong on the engineering side, but they've got traditional IT teams. So I agree with you. I think the cut and the split is important. Who does it and where they come from. So the more traditional business I work with would more likely need to get some of those specialist engineering roles on contract because they don't have them in-house. And after the project, they probably wouldn't need them because they tend to not want to go down the route of building out their own internal development team for the e-commerce. They quite still like that. We do IT and e-commerce is run by a development partner.
Yeah.
But having somebody who's the IT lead from as you said, makes perfect sense. Somebody who, from an IT systems architecture point of view, so it's almost like provides the solution architect role from an internal to make sure, from an integration path point of view, and from a data transfer and from a compliance point of view, that it's adhering to the business standards. So definitely, it's interesting. It's horses for courses. You need these skills. It's just who provides them.
Yeah, and the other one that you kind of touched on there, I guess the IT team are likely to provide all the kind of systems diagrams to all the kind of different external people coming in.
Well, you say they're likely to. The number of times I've been in projects with big successful businesses where the standard of internal documentation is utterly painful because there's just, it's evolved and become a Frankenstein, and there's a picture over here and a picture over there and it's not joined up, and nobody really truly knows exactly how the flows work. And this is why I come back to the BA bit, because in that type of project, the BA skill is essential, regardless of whether it comes from your new agency partner or you get a contractor in. Because if you just hand requirements over and the internal process is not fit for purpose, it doesn't matter. You're gonna run into problems later on in the project.
Yeah, I think that's another one. That's another one we could probably do a whole episode on. So the other thing that I've seen is where I've worked on a replatform project, documentation is pretty weak, and the platform's been fairly heavily customized, and there's a PIM in place or things like that. And then it's fairly common if it's a big replatform project that quite a few people leave afterwards, and essentially there's very little then for the new team coming in to understand the technology stack and how things were built and everything else. And that's where you start to get kind of preconceptions and things just fall apart a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. We had this issue when I was working at House of Fraser, and it was around wanting to improve the customer comms and use of notifications. And on the face value, it was really simple. It's okay, we want to use these triggers to improve how we communicate with customers, deliver a better customer. Brilliant. That's a good win in the project. But what hadn't been understood is the process was dependent on another system, which didn't matter what we set up from the back end of the e-commerce. It couldn't trigger it because it needed the other system to generate the trigger. So therefore, there was a dependency that wasn't understood. The process broke down. So you spend that time and effort getting the e-commerce system set up to deliver something that can't work because the rest of the process is broken. And that's why BAs are worth their weight in gold. And I've had this conversation, debate, whatever you want to call it, with some clients. You say, spend £10,000 to £20,000 now. And it seems horrible because it's we don't want to spend that. But that could unpick and save you more in the long term, because you'll have to redo parts of the project that now have to be recoded from an e-commerce point of view because it won't work. So sometimes spending more upfront saves you in the long run, but it's a hard business case to try and argue sometimes. So we've gone through. So for everyone listening, we've gone through a lot of different roles. Hopefully that's given. For some of you, you'll know a lot of this already. For others, it might be new, or it might be useful to think of roles in different ways. And you can now go, okay, who in our business or who in our partners should do this role? With that in mind, Paul, let's go on to another question, which is, which of these roles should you always have covered in-house wherever possible, and why?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it's probably easier to answer the other way around, but in-house,
You can't get off that easy. There's no fence sitting.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I think you need some level of creative in-house. I think you just need someone to own that part and kind of, own the communications around the creative side in-house, providing content, answering questions. I think you need someone that's like brand or creative in-house. And then ideally more, but that's kind of, I think, probably that's not strictly true actually, but you need some level of kind of influence from a creative person in-house. You need someone making decisions, someone that kind of understands things, someone that has access to all of the content and brand guidelines and all that kind of stuff. I think you need the roles that you said at the start. So project sponsor, someone that is kind of ultimately has a level of responsibility within the business, that can sign stuff off, etc. I think, and then alongside that, the budget holder, which might be the same person. Client lead equally could, well, probably not the same person, but could be. I think for me, they're the ones that are completely critical. And then in an ideal world, you'd probably have IT team as well and a PM. But I'm almost like I'm thinking about some of those bigger projects and then the tiny brands that are just starting out. I think they're the ones that for me that are critical.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. For me, I look at three capabilities. Number one is strategy. Number two is governance, and number three is execution. And they have to be owned in-house. And again, it doesn't matter who, and whether it's one person, two people, three people or more. But the strategy bit is, what are our project goals, objectives and success criteria? What are we doing this for? What is our vision, and how we know what success is? Because if you're not driving that internally, you're going to lose at some point, because there's no control, and it's really hard to know where to prioritize effort and investment if you don't have that clear strategic vision. Secondly, the governance bit. You talked about things like budgets, and the project discipline. Is somebody has got to have the ownership of, this is going wrong, or this is going well, or we've got an issue, we need to fix it. And somebody somewhere has to draw the line in the sand, because if you've got conflict or if you've got disagreement, at some point you've got to nip that in the bud and resolve it so the project doesn't get derailed and add 2-3 months to the timeline. And then the execution is, it's just making sure shit gets done. Right? It's okay. We've got 3 tasks that have been on hold for 3 weeks. They just need an answer now. Enough's enough. Let's stop messing around. Let's just get a decision made, even if we have to revisit that in the future. But let's not boil the ocean on this. I think if you get those 3 things covered, even if it's one person who's just pointing other people in direction and saying, okay, well, the PM is done external, the project delivery, but I'm governing it, then great.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then the next one, I guess the other one to that is like maybe what's best to outsource.
Yeah. Okay. From your project experience, what roles do you think are useful to outsource rather than let's buy somebody in-house?
Yeah. So I think I've already kind of covered this a little bit in the creative one. I kind of went the other way around with that answer, but I personally like outsourcing design to a specialist. I think I've just gradually come to that conclusion over time that if you bring in the right external creative people, the site just ends up in a much better place. So I'm a big fan of that. I think development, typically, outsourcing to a specialist team, you'll end up with a better quality site, essentially, particularly. And I work a lot with the SaaS platform, so it's mostly front end you're outsourcing, and having a team of people that are working on multiple sites within that platform and kind of framework day in, day out. I think you benefit from outsourcing it. And typically I find outsourcing helps from a timeline perspective as well. There's less risk around that side. I think some of the subject matter expert areas potentially dependent on the size of the business. So you talked about SEO, you talked about PPC.
Web analytics is a classic one for that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's another one. I'm not a massive fan of outsourcing QA, which is quite an interesting one. I think that's another kind of interesting debate. Maybe there's some level of like additional, like an extra level you could outsource, but I personally think a lot of the QA needs to be done by people.
Let's do a testing episode separately.
Yeah.
Because I agree, because discussing like how to do testing, what you should test, that's an episode in its own.
Yeah, completely agree. And that does seem to be a bit of a theme. A lot of the development agencies I've worked with recently like suggest outsourcing testing, but I think you can outsource a level, but not all of it.
It's not straightforward to do.
Exactly, yeah. And then, I mean, the other one is dependent on the size of the project. I think it can add a lot of value having someone external coming in that really understands the project platform again and the technologies, particularly if it's like, a headless build, someone that's kind of done it all before, has worked on similar projects. So them coming in as probably a solution architect would be really valuable. And again, that kind of BA person, even if it's just at the start, kind of enforcing a level of like definition. Again, I think that can be really valuable dependent on budgets, etc. What do you think? Yeah,
so my approach to this is skewed by experience I had years back with a B2B client. It's probably 3-4 years ago, where they were looking at replatforming and they were looking at fundamentally changing their design, the user journey, the functionality. They had big aims for growth, and they had a very smart husband and wife team running the business, and they had some core skills, but they didn't have an e-commerce team. And they had a timeline pressure from an investment point of view to get this sorted. And there wasn't time to properly bring it, because where they were located was hard to get the right level of skill in from an e-commerce leadership and project leadership point of view. So we ended up recruiting them basically a virtual outsourced project team, which included the e-commerce lead, so head of e-commerce, project manager, and I think it was a digital marketing person as well, because they were paid media was a really strong part of their acquisition piece. And we undernerved the pros and cons of this approach versus recruitment, and it was potentially wait 6+ months to get a team in place, or get cracking and gradually transition once they could bring in. So the advice that I gave them was, go down this route. We can outsource it. You can get the right people, work together. Here's the risks. We can mitigate them, put a mitigation plan in place for things like, lack of communication or whatever it might be. But they had such a strong senior management team in those two owners who were commercially astute, business savvy, knew their customers, knew their brand, and were very good at making decisions, and were very astute around budget management. There, actually, the risk was reduced because they could provide the governance and the strategy bit with the team who had the expertise to execute at an e-commerce level. And it worked really well. It actually worked really, really well. And they worked together for about 18 months, I think, in the end. So that changed my mind, because I'd said at the start to them, was like, I have reservations because I worry about not having the people next to you, but we got the right people. We put mitigation in place, and it did work. So it changed my mind on actually you can make it work with external people, provided you have the governance structure in place to control it.
Yeah, I think that's it. This is obviously the second time we've recorded this episode. First one wasn't brilliant from a technical and Wi-Fi perspective, and I think the last time you answered that question, you almost convinced me a bit more that it can work as well. But I think it's like you said, it's getting like the parameters set, making sure like you've got people that are like really ready to communicate, making sure that all of those layers of comms are perfect, like layers of sign off, etc. But I think you've almost convinced me that it can work well.
Yeah, it's also contracts, because it's not just a standard. You've got to really get your contracts nailed down with each of these people, all their roles and responsibilities are, and what the expectation is, so that they are, when they're signing up, that they know that they have that level of ownership within the project. It's not just a head of e-commerce. It's a head of e-commerce with project delivery ownership of the e-commerce project, who must do these 4 or 5 roles within the project. So knowing that, because then you can find the right person. Because if you just go for a head of e-commerce, you might find somebody who is brilliant at trading a website, but has no major project experience for replatforming, and therefore would be learning on the job. And you can't afford that in this scenario, because you have to have somebody who can bring that learning to you to benefit you as the business owner. So exactly. All of this has risk. Every model you take for using skilled people has a risk. You've got to just decide what the risks are and then put a mitigation around it. Doesn't make it perfect, but at least it kind of reduces the likelihood of things going peak tong.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the end of our question. I'm hoping this has been useful for people. I know it always feels like a whistle-stop tour, but we've talked a lot about the different roles, who you bring in-house, what ownership you should have in-house versus what you can rely on external people for. So, Paul, if if you could leave listeners with one like handy wrap-up comment or piece of advice, what would it be?
That's a good question. I think that it would be, and this is something we haven't talked about, it's not even really that related to this episode, but there's a couple of things that you've said that have led me to say this. But when it comes to planning the project, I think most of these projects are going to be like a CapEx project. And I think it's really when you go and create the business case, make sure you think about what you really need, because you mentioned a point earlier, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was like, put that extra 20 grand in, you'll benefit from it further down the line. I guess just thinking about what you're putting into that CapEx and how you can get the most out of a project.
I think we've put an extra 20 grand in for Digital Juggler, wasn't it?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, 20, 40. But yeah, no, I think that's the thing. Like, just try to really think about how you get the best out of everyone in a project, and making sure that business case you're putting forward covers you essentially.
I think that's probably the best way of wrapping it up. And actually, I think I would definitely agree with that. Is look at what you're trying to deliver and look at all the skills you need to achieve it, and what you have and what you don't have, and provision for it. Even if it's I think SEO, we need technical SEO for, I'm estimating 15K, 20, estimate on the high side. Because going back to a finance team or the budget holder later on saying, hey, we've come in 20 grand under budget, only gets you brownie points. If you go back and go, I underestimated that, people get a bit annoyed, and it's harder to fight for. And also it can erode trust in your kind of planning. So definitely, I think that's a really good parting point, is think carefully about your cost of ownership model and roles before you make the decision. So wonderful. I hope you've enjoyed it and it's been useful. Thanks as always for listening. We really do appreciate you tuning in and taking the time. Keep an ear out for our next episode. There'll be one on testing coming up. We learned that during today. And let us know any topics you'd like to cover. And also, as I said at the start, please do subscribe if you're new to this. The more subscribers, the better. It helps raise our profile. And we'd love a rating on Apple or Spotify or YouTube. We're obviously trying to get the name out for the Replatform podcast. Catch up with you next time. For more information on this topic, head over to replatform.fm for our audio podcasts. To discuss a project, or if you'd like to chat about any of the topics covered in this episode in more detail, please reach out to myself, James Gurd, or my co-host Paul Rogers via LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and keep your ears peeled for the next episode.